3 billion people, 3 nuclear arsenals. 3 countries running out of water while their young populations demand jobs that don't exist. In the shadow of the Himalayas, the world's most dangerous equation is taking shape, and most Americans have no idea how close we are to witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Picture this: a farmer in Kashmir checks his phone for news about border skirmishes, while his teenage son asks why the well ran dry. A factory worker in Lahore watches prices climb as his government spends billions on missiles instead of infrastructure. A college graduate in Mumbai discovers that despite her engineering degree, the only jobs available require connections she doesn't have. These aren't 3 separate stories, they're 3 threads of the same rope that's about to snap. Because when you combine the world's largest populations with nuclear weapons and shrinking resources, you don't get gradual change. You get pressure that builds until something breaks. According to Reuters and demographic studies, by 2030, India and China will each have over 1.4 billion people, while Pakistan's population will exceed 250 million. That's nearly half of humanity living in a region where 3 nuclear-armed neighbors eye each other with suspicion that grows deeper every year. Welcome to Crisis Zone. Today we're examining what happens when population pressure meets nuclear capability, and why the answer to that question could reshape your life regardless of where you call home. Here's the reality that keeps strategists awake. India adds the equivalent of Australia's entire population every single year. Pakistan's population doubles every 35 years. China, despite decades of population control, still faces the challenge of managing 1.4 billion people with rising expectations and limited resources. But numbers alone don't tell the story. According to World Bank data and demographic research, these populations are young, connected, and increasingly frustrated with governments that promise prosperity but deliver stagnation. In India, over 600 million people are under 25 years old. That's almost twice the entire population of the United States, and they're entering job markets that can't absorb them. According to employment studies, India needs to create 10 million new jobs annually just to keep unemployment stable. They're creating fewer than half that number. Pakistan faces an even more acute version of the same crisis. With 60% of its population under 30, the country needs massive economic growth to provide opportunity for young people who increasingly see their government as corrupt and ineffective. According to Pakistani economic analyses, the country requires sustained 7% annual growth to prevent social instability. They haven't achieved that level in over a decade. China's challenge is different, but equally dangerous. Their population is aging rapidly while their economy slows. According to demographic projections, China will lose 70 million working-age people by 2035 while adding 130 million elderly citizens who need support. This creates enormous pressure on a generation that grew up expecting continuous improvement in living standards. Resource scarcity multiplies these population pressures. The 3 countries share river systems that are drying up due to climate change and overuse. According to water security studies, the Indus River system that Pakistan depends on for agriculture is losing 10% of its flow every decade. The Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers that sustain hundreds of millions of Indians are similarly stressed. When young, frustrated populations compete for shrinking resources while their governments possess nuclear weapons, history suggests the outcome isn't peaceful negotiation. It's the kind of pressure that makes rational leaders consider irrational options. And here's what makes this particularly dangerous. All 3 governments know they're sitting on powder kegs. Their response isn't to address underlying problems, that's too expensive and too slow. Their response is to find external enemies that can distract domestic anger. Here's the mini recap. 3 nuclear-armed nations are managing young, frustrated populations competing for shrinking resources, creating domestic pressure that governments redirect toward external conflicts rather than internal solutions. The geography of South Asia turns population pressure into a strategic nightmare. These aren't three countries separated by vast oceans, they're neighbors sharing borders, rivers, and grudges that go back generations. India and Pakistan have fought for wars since 1947, and they've been nuclear powers since 1998. That means an entire generation has grown up in both countries accepting nuclear weapons as normal tools of statcraft. According to nuclear policy studies, this normalization makes limited nuclear use more likely during future crises. The China-India border stretches over 2,100 miles through some of the world's most inhospitable terrain, and both sides have been building military infrastructure along disputed sections. According to satellite imagery analysis, China has constructed permanent facilities and road networks in areas that India considers its territory, while India has responded with its own military buildups. But here's what makes the current situation uniquely dangerous. These aren't Cold War-style standoffs between two superpowers with sophisticated command and control systems. These are three developing nations with nuclear weapons, growing populations, and governments under enormous domestic pressure to appear strong. Pakistan's nuclear doctrine explicitly includes first-use options against India if conventional defenses fail. According to Pakistani military statements, they view nuclear weapons as equalizers against India's larger conventional military. This creates incentives to escalate conflicts quickly rather than fight prolonged conventional wars they can't win. India has responded by developing Cold Start military doctrine, the ability to launch rapid, limited conventional attacks against Pakistan before international intervention can stop them. According to Indian strategic thinking, quick victories would present Pakistan with fait accompli situations where nuclear escalation would be irrational. The problem is that Pakistani planners see Cold Start as an existential threat that justifies nuclear response. According to Pakistani defense analyses, they interpret Indian rapid attack capabilities as proof that India plans to dismember Pakistan through conventional aggression. China complicates this nuclear triangle by maintaining close relationships with Pakistan while facing border disputes with India. According to strategic analyses, Chinese weapons sales to Pakistan are specifically designed to counter Indian conventional advantages, creating three-way arms race where each side's security measures threaten the others. Water disputes add another layer of potential nuclear triggers. All three countries depend on river systems that originate in disputed territory. When upstream countries build dams or divert water, downstream populations face agricultural catastrophe. According to water security experts, conflicts over river access have historically led to wars, and now those same disputes occur between nuclear powers. The speed of modern communication means that border incidents escalate faster than ever before. Social media spreads news of military clashes within minutes, creating domestic pressure for retaliation before governments can assess situations or consider de-escalation. Here's the mini recap. Three nuclear-armed neighbors share disputed borders, water resources, and populations that demand strong responses to perceived threats, creating multiple pathways for conventional conflicts to escalate to nuclear exchanges. Let me walk you through the three most likely scenarios that could turn population pressure and nuclear capability into actual catastrophe, because understanding these pathways helps explain why distant conflicts could affect every American family. Let's start with the first scenario, water wars, which I think is one of the most important scenarios. It begins with drought. Climate change reduces snowfall in the Himalayas while growing populations increase water demand. Pakistan's agricultural heartland starts failing as the Indus River system drops below critical levels. Millions of farmers face starvation while their government blames Indian dam construction for stealing their water. Pakistani leaders face impossible choices: accept agricultural catastrophe that could trigger revolution or take military action to secure water access. According to Water Security Analyses, Pakistan views control of Kashmir not just as territorial dispute but as survival necessity since the region controls headwaters of rivers they depend on. India interprets Pakistani military movements as territorial aggression and responds with conventional forces. Within days, limited border conflicts escalate as both sides mobilize reserves. Pakistan, facing conventional defeat, issues nuclear ultimatums. India calls their bluff. The first nuclear weapons used in anger since 1945 detonate over military targets, hoping to limit escalation while demonstrating resolve. Scenario 2, the economic collapse chain reaction. This one starts in financial markets. China's economic slowdown triggers capital flight from emerging markets. Pakistan, already struggling with debt payments, faces currency collapse and cannot import food or fuel. Popular unrest threatens the government's survival. Desperate for distraction from economic failure, Pakistani leaders launch limited military action against Indian positions in Kashmir, calculating that border nationalism will unite domestic opposition. India responds conventionally, but Pakistani military, knowing they can't win prolonged conflict, authorizes tactical nuclear weapons to force quick Indian withdrawal. China, fearing Indian nuclear escalation could threaten Chinese territory, issues warnings that sound like threats. India, facing nuclear pressure from two directions, strikes Pakistani nuclear facilities to prevent further escalation. Pakistan retaliates against Indian cities. Within hours, millions are dead and millions more are fleeing radioactive fallout. Scenario 3. The accident that wasn't. An equipment malfunction triggers false alarms in Pakistani early warning systems during a period of high tension. Military commanders, trained to assume Indian first strike capabilities, authorize nuclear retaliation before discovering the error. Indian radar detects incoming Pakistani missiles and automatically launches counter-strikes. The accident kills hundreds of thousands before either government understands what happened. China, fearing regional nuclear conflict threatens its interests, mobilizes forces to secure Pakistani nuclear facilities. India interprets Chinese military movements as support for Pakistani aggression. Three-way nuclear crisis develops from technical failure that no one intended. Each scenario demonstrates how population pressure, resource scarcity, and nuclear weapons create systems where small mistakes produce catastrophic outcomes. Unlike Cold War scenarios where two superpowers could maintain careful escalation control, South Asian nuclear dynamics involve multiple actors with different capabilities, different doctrines, and different domestic pressures. The most terrifying aspect is timing. Modern nuclear delivery systems travel faster than communication networks. Once weapons launch, there may not be enough time for second thoughts, clarifications, or negotiations that could prevent civilization-ending mistakes. Here's the mini recap. Water disputes, economic pressures, and technical failures could trigger nuclear exchanges between countries whose populations and proximity ensure that limited nuclear war becomes unlimited catastrophe within hours. The clinical term nuclear exchange doesn't capture what nuclear weapons would actually do to the most densely populated region on Earth. Let me paint you the picture that defense planners study but rarely discuss publicly. A single nuclear weapon detonated over Karachi, Pakistan's largest city, would instantly kill over 1 million people. The same weapon over New Delhi would kill even more due to higher population density. But immediate deaths are just the beginning of the catastrophe. According to climate modeling studies, even a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan would inject enough smoke and debris into the atmosphere to trigger global cooling. Temperatures would drop worldwide, growing seasons would shorten, and agricultural productivity would plummet across every continent, including North America. The refugee crisis would dwarf every previous humanitarian disaster. According to disaster modeling research, nuclear exchanges in South Asia would create 50 to 100 million refugees within weeks. These aren't theoretical numbers, they represent families fleeing radioactive zones, walking across borders with nothing but radiation sickness and desperation. Economic collapse would follow immediately. According to financial modeling, nuclear weapons used anywhere in the world would trigger global market crashes as investors fled all-risk assets. But South Asian nuclear war would be particularly devastating because the region produces crucial components for global supply chains. India manufactures generic pharmaceuticals that supply 20% of global medicine needs. Pakistan produces textiles that clothe hundreds of millions worldwide. China's manufacturing networks extend throughout both countries. Nuclear destruction of these capabilities would create shortages and price spikes that affect every American family. The radiation effects would persist for decades. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, modern nuclear weapons are larger and dirtier. According to radiological studies, areas around Ground Zero would remain uninhabitable for years, while lower-level contamination would affect agriculture and water supplies across vast regions. Medical systems would collapse under the weight of radiation casualties they're not equipped to handle. According to healthcare capacity analyses, the entire world doesn't have enough burn units, radiation treatment facilities, or trained medical personnel to handle casualties from South Asian nuclear exchange. But perhaps most importantly for Americans, nuclear weapons use anywhere breaks the taboo that has prevented their use since 1945. Once nuclear war becomes normalized in one region, every international dispute becomes potentially nuclear. The threshold between conventional conflict and nuclear escalation disappears permanently. Here's the mini recap. Nuclear war in South Asia would kill millions immediately, trigger global climate disruption, create unprecedented refugee crises, collapse international economic systems, contaminate vast territories for decades, overwhelm medical systems worldwide, and normalize nuclear weapons use in all future conflicts. Here's the uncomfortable truth about emergency preparedness in the world's most nuclear-threatened region. None of these countries are remotely ready for the catastrophes their own weapons could create. According to World Health Organization assessments, India has roughly 70,000 hospital beds available for emergency treatment. That sounds substantial until you realize that a single nuclear weapon would produce more casualties than their entire medical system can handle. Pakistan's medical infrastructure is even more limited, with most advanced trauma care concentrated in a few urban centers that would likely be primary targets. Civil defense systems that worked during the Cold War assume populations can evacuate to rural areas and wait out radiation dangers. But South Asia doesn't have rural areas with low population density. According to demographic analyses, even supposedly remote regions have population densities that would make effective evacuation impossible. Emergency communication systems depend on electrical grids and telecommunications networks that nuclear weapons would destroy instantly. According to infrastructure vulnerability studies, single nuclear detonations would knock out communications across hundreds of miles, making coordinated emergency response impossible exactly when it's most needed. Food distribution networks face similar vulnerabilities. According to agricultural logistics studies, these countries depend on just-in-time food delivery systems that break down when transportation infrastructure gets damaged. Urban populations would face starvation within days if supply chains stop functioning. Water treatment facilities represent perhaps the most critical vulnerability. According to utility infrastructure analyses, most water processing plants lack backup power systems that could function when electrical grids fail. Millions of survivors of nuclear attacks would face death from contaminated water even in areas not directly affected by radiation. International aid systems aren't designed for nuclear disaster response. According to humanitarian relief studies, current international emergency response capabilities could handle perhaps 100,000 casualties from natural disasters. Nuclear war casualties would exceed those numbers by orders of magnitude, while making relief delivery impossible due to radiation dangers. The most serious gap is psychological preparation. Unlike countries that lived through World War II or extensive civil defense programs, South Asian populations have no experience with mass casualty disasters. According to disaster psychology research, populations without previous emergency experience panic more readily and make decisions that worsen survival chances. Government continuity planning assumes that communication links will function and that political leadership will survive initial attacks. According to continuity of government studies, none of these countries have distributed command systems that could maintain governmental control if capital cities were destroyed. Here's the mini recap. India, Pakistan, and China lack medical capacity, evacuation capabilities, communication systems, food distribution networks, water treatment backup, international aid access, population psychological preparation, and government continuity plans adequate for nuclear disaster response. Subscribe to Crisis Zone and join Americans who recognize that distant threats become personal consequences in a connected world. In the comments, tell us what aspect of South Asian nuclear risk concerns you most. And how is your family preparing for global disruptions that could begin tomorrow? Because while we can't prevent nuclear weapons from existing, we can prepare for the world they're creating.